The neighborhood was supposed to be quiet, orderly, and predictable. That was the entire reason people bought into this development in the first place. Wide, well-paved streets curved in neat arcs through cul-de-sacs lined with identical two-story homes. Trimmed lawns, polished driveways, and mailbox posts painted in uniform white gave the area a look that belonged in a brochure. To live there meant more than just owning a house. It meant belonging to a community with rules, structure, and expectations. For the narrator, that order was part of the comfort. Every evening after work, the same routine unfolded. Drive into the neighborhood, pull into the assigned parking spot directly in front of the townhouse, and step inside knowing that home was waiting. The HOA had set it up so each residence had exactly one numbered space, with a few guest spots scattered around. It wasn't luxury, but it worked, until the night it didn't. The first time it happened, it was brushed off as an inconvenience. The narrator returned home late, headlights cutting through the shadows, only to find the spot already occupied by a car that clearly didn't belong. The vehicle sat there like it owned the space, parked crookedly, engine still ticking with heat. Forced to circle the block, the narrator finally squeezed into a guest space down the street. Annoyed but tired, it was left unaddressed. Maybe it was an accident, a guest who didn't understand the rules. But the next night, it happened again. And the night after that, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every evening, the same neighbor's car appeared in the spot, as if it had always been theirs. The guest spaces filled quickly, leaving the narrator walking longer distances each night with grocery bags cutting into their arms. The quiet order of the neighborhood cracked under the weight of small but persistent disruption. The neighbor in question lived only a few houses down. He was new to the community, having moved in just weeks earlier. His house was easy to identify. Boxes still stacked inside the garage, blinds tilted awkwardly, porch light burned out. From the start, he carried an air of disregard. Loud music spilled from his car. When he pulled in, trash cans lingered on the curb long after pickup day. Small offenses, yes, but in a neighborhood bound by strict HOA guidelines, small offenses stacked into a reputation quickly. By the end of the first week, frustration curdled into something heavier. The HOA had rules for parking, and every resident signed the same contract. Assigned spaces were not suggestions. They were obligations. Violating that rule wasn't just inconsiderate. It was a direct challenge to the structure everyone else lived under. The narrator tried to let it go. Surely it couldn't last. Surely the neighbor would realize his mistake and correct it. But instead, it escalated. He parked there without fail, leaving the narrator scrambling for open guest spaces late at night, sometimes blocks away. What once felt like home now felt like a competition. Whoever arrived first claimed the space, regardless of what the HOA rules said. That was when the resentment grew sharper. Each evening walk from the distant guest lot brought simmering thoughts. Why should one person get to ignore the rules while everyone else followed them? Why should home feel like a punishment after a long day? The unfairness sank its claws deeper with every late-night inconvenience. Neighbors began to notice, too. Passing comments about that guy circled in whispers. Others had dealt with him as well. Overflowing trash cans, barking dogs left outside too long, loud engine revving in the middle of the night. He wasn't just ignoring the parking rules. He was ignoring the neighborhood itself. By the end of the second week, the narrator decided something had to change. But how? HOA complaints were an option, but the board moved slowly, often bogged down by meetings and paperwork. Confrontation carried risks too. Nobody wanted to escalate into shouting matches or worse. Yet the nightly theft of the spot couldn't continue. The frustration transformed into resolve. This wasn't just about a parking space anymore. It was about principle. It was about fairness. It was about not letting someone trample over boundaries and expect silence in return. The plan, however, wasn't yet clear. All that was certain was this. The neighbor had started a silent war, and the narrator was no longer willing to lose it. And so, the first seeds of strategy began to form. Watching the neighbor's habits, noting the times he arrived, the way he carelessly angled his car into the stolen spot, the pattern of behavior that left openings to be used against him. The HOA rules were written, yes, but rules could only do so much without enforcement. Outsmarting him would take more than filing complaints. It would take creativity. It would take patience. And most of all, it would take timing. The narrator knew the coming days would determine everything, whether the spot would remain stolen or whether it would finally be reclaimed. The quiet battle lines were drawn across asphalt and painted numbers, and the real fight was only beginning. The first step was simple: observation. Every evening, the narrator began to notice the rhythm of the neighbor's movements. His car, a beat-up sedan with mismatched hubcaps, arrived almost like clockwork between 7 and 8 o'clock. He parked casually, leaving his vehicle stretched half into lines, as though the space were a suggestion rather than a boundary. It was clear he wasn't rushing, wasn't desperate. He simply assumed that spot was his. The narrator tried small act of resistance at first. Coming home earlier, hoping to beat him to the space, felt like a reasonable solution. For a brief moment, it worked. Pulling into the assigned spot ahead of schedule, shutting off the car with a sense of triumph. It felt like winning a battle, but the victory was short-lived. When the neighbor came home and found the spot occupied, he didn't retreat to a guest space as any reasonable person would. Instead, he slid into another resident's numbered spot without hesitation. That night, muffled voices drifted through the street as another family discovered their space stolen. The problem wasn't solved. It had only shifted. The neighbor wasn't just careless. He was entitled. His actions proved that no matter where he went, the rules didn't apply to him. The next attempt came through polite, indirect measures. Notes left neatly tucked under his windshield wipers, written in firm but courteous language. This space is assigned. The first one read, "Please use guest parking." Another note followed the next night, a little less patient, a little sharper in tone. The response was silence. The notes vanished, crumpled, or discarded, but his car kept appearing in the same spot. It wasn't just defiance, it was mockery. Every time the narrator trudged down the street to a distant guest space, it felt like the neighbor was laughing without ever opening his mouth. The HOA entered the picture soon after. A formal complaint was filed, complete with photos and timestamps. The board acknowledged the issue, promised to look into it, and added it to the agenda for the next monthly meeting. But that meeting was still weeks away. In the meantime, the problem only grew. The neighbor now treated the spot as his permanent parking space, arriving with unshakable confidence, and leaving his car there overnight without guilt. Other neighbors began voicing their frustrations too. Whispered conversations at mailboxes turned into subtle alliances. Everyone had a story about him. The late-night noise, the uncollected trash, the way he left his dog to bark endlessly in the yard. But while the other grievances annoyed them, the parking issue infuriated them. It was visible, undeniable, and happening right in the center of the street. The narrator's resentment deepened. Each night became a ritual of frustration, slowly circling the block, watching the stolen space come into view, and finally resigning to a distant guest spot. Grocery bags dug deeper into arms, late walks stretched longer, and the unfairness rooted itself like a thorn that refused to come out. Something had to change. The first real act of defiance came one late evening. The narrator pulled into the spot early, determined not to yield. Hours later, the sound of the neighbor's car rumbling down the street broke the silence. The sedan slowed, headlights sweeping over the driveway as he realized the spot wasn't his to take. Instead of retreating to the guest lot, he idled for several long minutes, engine humming, before finally sliding into another resident space again. The victory felt hollow. Protecting the assigned spot only meant shifting the pain onto someone else. The cycle repeated itself the next night, and the next, until tension across the neighborhood grew sharper. By now, the neighbor's reputation had sunk to the bottom. Every house on the block seemed to have some grievance against him, yet he moved through the streets without shame. It wasn't simply laziness. It was bold disregard. The HOA rules meant nothing to him, and the narrator began to realize that waiting for official action would accomplish nothing. The idea of a real strategy began to take root. Outsmarting him would mean more than complaints or patience. It would require using his arrogance against him. He believed he was untouchable, that nobody could stop him. That belief was his weakness. Still, before any plan could be carried out, patience was necessary. Timing mattered. The narrator watched carefully, keeping track of every arrival, every departure, every careless moment when the neighbor flaunted his disregard. The notes hadn't worked. Complaints hadn't worked. Simply holding the spot hadn't worked. The solution would need to be something he couldn't ignore, something that left no doubt about whose space it was. The frustration transformed into focus. It was no longer about anger. It was about building the right moment to strike. Night after night, As the neighbor's car once again rolled into the wrong spot, the narrator quietly prepared. The first small battles had been lost, but the war was still unfolding. And in the quiet shadows of the neighborhood, a plan was beginning to form, one that would turn the tables entirely. The tension in the neighborhood was no longer subtle. What had begun as a quiet irritation now echoed across the street with every passing evening. The stolen parking spot became a symbol, a daily reminder of how one person's entitlement could fracture the unspoken agreement everyone else lived by. Neighbors who once exchanged polite greetings now lingered to commiserate, trading complaints about the same man. They spoke in hushed tones near mailboxes, shook their heads when passing his house, and rolled their eyes whenever a sedan rumbled past. It was no longer just the narrator's problem. It was the community's problem. And the weight of that truth only fueled the determination to act. The first step in escalation was subtle but deliberate: documentation. The narrator began photographing the neighbor's car in the spot night after night. Photos were time-stamped, neatly stored, and backed up. Some nights included video, capturing the careless way he pulled in, engine sputtering, headlights lingering far too long on the wrong space. This wasn't just personal grievance anymore. It was evidence. But documentation alone wouldn't solve it. The HOA had already proven slow to act. Rules were clear, but enforcement required more than promises of future meetings. The neighbor's disregard was too immediate, too blatant, to wait for bureaucracy. So, the narrator tested the waters with a more direct tactic: blocking. One evening, after returning early, the car was parked in the assigned spot as usual. When the neighbor later arrived and predictably slid a sedan into a different resident space, the narrator parked a second vehicle, borrowed from a visiting friend, directly behind his car, boxing him in. For hours, the sedan sat trapped, headlights flashing briefly as he realized he couldn't leave. By morning, the friend's car was gone and the neighbor's sedan remained, but the message had been clear. It wasn't just about inconvenience anymore. It was about control. For the first time, the neighbor experienced what it felt like to be powerless. Word spread quickly through the street. Some laughed quietly about the stunt. Others warned it might escalate too far. But everyone agreed on one thing: the man had finally been rattled. The next night, though, the cycle resumed. The sedan was back in the stolen spot, angled slightly more aggressively than before, as if staking a claim. If the blocking had unsettled him, he refused to show it. Instead, he doubled down, parking with even greater arrogance. The narrator's frustration flared, but so did the resolve. If subtlety didn't work, escalation would continue. The following week introduced a new measure: brightly colored cones, purchased at a hardware store, placed directly in the spot before leaving in the morning. Each evening, when returning home, the cones stood like sentinels, a bold visual reminder that this was not a free-for-all. The first night, the neighbor moved them carelessly to the curb and parked anyway. But when the narrator replaced them the next day, reinforced with laminated signs reading "assigned space, violators will be towed," the effect was stronger. The sedan still returned, but hesitation was visible now. He lingered before moving the cones, glanced at the signs longer than before, and parked with less swagger. His confidence wasn't gone, but cracks were forming. Neighbors began to notice the battle playing out. Some offered encouragement, nodding approvingly at the cones. Others quietly cheered the narrator's persistence. For the first time, the narrator wasn't just fighting alone. There was an audience, a chorus of neighbors eager to see justice served. But the neighbor wasn't finished. If anything, the resistance only emboldened him. One evening, the narrator returned home to find the cones missing entirely. A quick search revealed them tossed carelessly into the ditch down the road. His sedan sat smugly in the space again, as if daring anyone to challenge him. The pettiness of it was infuriating, but also clarifying. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't laziness. This was deliberate defiance. He knew the rules, he knew the complaints, and he chose to ignore them. His arrogance wasn't a side effect. It was a point. The narrator's plan needed to evolve. Blocking him, warning him, even embarrassing him. None of it had worked long-term. He thrived on defiance. But every arrogant man had a weakness, and the narrator was determined to find his. That was when the idea of outsmarting him began to shift from vague frustration to concrete strategy. Outsmarting meant more than resisting. It meant turning his behavior against him. He believed he could take what wasn't his, night after night, with no consequences. But what if the very habit he relied on became the trap that unraveled him? The neighborhood's frustration had now crystallized into something bigger. Every stolen spot was a provocation, and every night it happened, more people rallied quietly to the narrator's side. The neighbor was no longer just a nuisance. He was a villain, and villains always overplayed their hand. The narrator's preparation grew meticulous. Notes weren't thrown away now. They were photographed before being placed. Cones weren't just plastic. They were weighted, harder to casually toss aside. Each step wasn't just resistance, but building blocks for something larger. By the end of that week, the narrator no longer felt like the victim of a situation. Instead, there was control in the planning, in the careful build-up to what was coming. The stolen spot wasn't just a daily irritation anymore, it was bait. And when the right moment came, the trap would finally spring. The neighborhood had reached its breaking point. What started as irritation had become routine disruption, and by now, almost every resident had a story about the neighbor. His parking violations, his trash bins left out, his music blaring too late at night. But it was a stolen spot night after night that stood as his most brazen offense. The HOA moved slowly, promising action but bogged down in formalities. Letters had been mailed, notices drafted, but nothing came quickly enough to restore order. And so, the narrator realized the only way forward was to take matters into their own hands. If the rules couldn't stop him, strategy would. The plan started with timing. For weeks, the neighbor had been predictable. His sedan returned between 7 and 8 most nights, gliding into the stolen spot with shameless consistency. That routine would be his undoing. Like clockwork, arrogance made him predictable. Predictability made him vulnerable. The first step of the trap was simple but crucial: reinforcement of ownership. The narrator went beyond cones this time, installing a sturdy, freestanding, reserved parking sign directly in front of the space. Heavy enough not to blow over, tall enough to be seen from the street, it stood as a glaring declaration. This wasn't a casual warning. It was an official-looking marker, daring anyone to challenge it. Neighbors took notice immediately. Passing cars slowed, pedestrians nodded approvingly. The spot no longer looked like just another painted rectangle on the pavement. It looked claimed, guarded, untouchable. But the narrator knew the neighbor wouldn't respect it. That was the point. Sure enough, the very night the sign appeared, the sedan arrived. Headlights washed over the bold lettering, pausing for a long moment. And then, as expected, the neighbor got out of his car, dragged the sign roughly to the curb, and slid his sedan into place as if nothing had changed. It was perfect. The narrator had been waiting with a camera in hand, documenting everything from behind the curtains. The removal of the sign wasn't just disrespect. It was vandalism. Now there was proof, clear and undeniable, that the neighbor had deliberately ignored warnings and destroyed property to take what wasn't his. But the trap was only half set. Evidence was important, yes, but humiliation was better. This wasn't just about paperwork. It was about showing the entire neighborhood who he really was. The second phase came days later, carefully coordinated with a group of neighbors who were equally fed up. They agreed to stage their own cars in a way that would leave only the narrator's assigned spot visibly open when the neighbor returned. Every guest space was intentionally filled, every driveway neatly occupied. It wasn't suspicious. It looked like an ordinary busy evening. But in reality, it was bait. When the sedan rolled into the street that night, the pattern played out exactly as expected. He slowed, scanned the block, saw only one open space, the one he believed he had conquered. Without hesitation, he pulled in, headlights cutting across the pavement, engine sputtering as he settled in. He thought he had won again. What he didn't know was that half a dozen neighbors had been waiting, watching from porches, driveways, and behind curtains. Phones were ready, cameras rolling, evidence stacking up. The man had walked right into the snare, exposing his entitlement in front of the very people he had been antagonizing for weeks. The narrator emerged moments later, calm but deliberate, documenting the car from every angle. The bold, reserved parking sign had been dragged aside once again, lying helplessly in the grass. The sedan sat in the space like a trophy he thought he had earned, while in reality, it was the clearest proof yet of his arrogance. Neighbors began stepping forward too, quietly but firmly, cameras still rolling. For the first time, the man couldn't pretend this was invisible. He couldn't dismiss it as a misunderstanding. He was surrounded, not by confrontation, but by undeniable evidence. The trap had sprung. The very next morning, the compiled videos and photos were sent directly to the HOA and property management company. Unlike previous complaints, this package was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just one person's frustration anymore. It was a collective weight of an entire neighborhood, neatly documented, time-stamped, and undeniable. The narrator knew the process would still take time. Warnings would be issued, fines drafted, perhaps even towing enforced if he continued. But something had already shifted. For the first time since the conflict began, the neighbor wasn't in control. The spot wasn't a playground anymore. It was a stage where his arrogance had been exposed for all to see. And though the paperwork would take weeks, the real punishment had already begun. His reputation in the neighborhood had collapsed. Where once people avoided eye contact, now they stared openly when he drove past. Whispers turned to pointed looks. Every night he parked his car, he knew dozens of eyes were watching. The narrator had reclaimed something greater than a parking space. They had reclaimed power. And the neighbor, though still stubborn, was beginning to feel the walls closing in. But he wasn't finished yet. Even under the weight of evidence, even with the neighborhood united against him, he continued to push back. The sedan still appeared in the spot some nights, defiantly ignoring the rules. But now, each offense only tightened the noose further. Every act of arrogance became another stone in the wall, closing around him. The trap had worked, but the game wasn't over. By the time the HOA meeting rolled around, the tension in the neighborhood was impossible to ignore. The parking battle had become the central story of the block, whispered about at mailboxes, debated over fences, and dissected in late-night phone calls. What had once been an individual inconvenience had grown into a community-wide symbol of defiance versus order. The compiled evidence had made its way to the HOA board. Dozens of photos, timestamps, and videos from multiple residents painted a picture that was too sharp to dismiss. It wasn't just the narrator's word against the neighbors anymore. It was the undeniable truth captured on screen. The stolen spot, the drag signs, the discarded cones, the brazen disregard for every warning. It was all there. The board, usually slow-moving and reluctant to intervene, had no choice but to act. A violation notice was issued, followed by a fine. It was a kind of penalty that, under ordinary circumstances, would be enough to deter most residents. But the neighbor was not most residents. Instead of backing down, he grew louder. The night after the violation notice was taped to his door, his sedan once again appeared in the stolen spot. This time, it wasn't angled casually. It was parked aggressively, dead center, like a challenge. Music blared from the car before he shut off, echoing across the quiet street, as if to announce his defiance. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, watching performance unfold. He wasn't just ignoring the HOA, he was taunting them. The fine had humbled him. It had enraged him. The following morning, the narrator discovered the reserved parking sign smashed, the post bent, the lettering cracked, the base splintered where it had been struck. The destruction wasn't subtle. It was deliberate, an act of retaliation meant to send a message. And it did. The neighborhood buzzed with shock and anger. What had started as entitlement had turned into vandalism. The whispers at the mailboxes grew sharper, more urgent. This wasn't just a parking issue anymore. This was escalation into outright hostility. The HOA doubled down. A second notice was delivered, the fine increased, and a warning issued. Continued violations would result in towing. Still, the neighbor didn't flinch. If anything, his behavior grew bolder. He began leaving his car in the stolen spot for longer stretches, sometimes into the middle of the next day, as though daring anyone to touch it. The narrator's frustration hardened into resolve. It wasn't about waiting for rules to work anymore. It was about endurance, about proving that no amount of arrogance could outlast strategy and persistence. Every night the car appeared, more photos were taken. Every act of defiance became more ammunition in the growing case against him. Neighbors rallied tighter now. What had once been quiet support turned into open solidarity. People offered up their guest spaces to the narrator, shared their own photos of the man's offenses, and voiced their outrage directly to the HOA. For the first time, the entire street was aligned, not just annoyed but determined, and that unity began to press on the neighbor like a weight he couldn't shake. The smug confidence he once carried began to falter. Where he used to stroll casually from his car to his house, Now he moved more quickly, glancing over his shoulder at the stares he couldn't avoid. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were open judgment, audible disapproval, cold silence when he passed by. The breaking point came one evening when the towing truck arrived. It wasn't subtle. The sound of chains and metal echoed across the street as the truck backed into position. Neighbors gathered quietly on porches, watching as the sedan was hooked and lifted. Its owner burst from his house in outrage, shouting, gesturing wildly, but the tow driver remained unmoved. The violation was documented, the order official, the consequences inevitable. Within minutes, the car that claimed the spot so arrogantly was hauled away, taillights fading into the distance as silence settled over the block. For the narrator, it was vindication. Weeks of frustration, strategy, and persistence had finally paid off. The spot sat empty that night, untouched, pristine. For the first time in what felt like forever, pulling into it felt like coming home again. But the neighbor's fury didn't vanish with the car. The next day, he paced angrily along the sidewalk, muttering under his breath. He made calls loudly, gesturing with his hands, as though threatening invisible enemies. He slammed his trash can lids, stomped across his porch, and glared at passing neighbors. His anger was no longer hidden. It was out in the open, spilling into every movement. The narrator knew the battle wasn't entirely finished. Fines could pile up, cars could be towed, but arrogance rarely disappeared overnight. The neighbor would lash out again, in small ways or large. But something fundamental had shifted. The power wasn't his anymore. The neighborhood had seen him for what he was, and they weren't afraid to push back. The showdown wasn't just about reclaiming a parking spot. It was about exposing entitlement, stripping it of its shield, and proving that rules and persistence could triumph over arrogance. That night, the narrator parked in the assigned spot once again. The sedan was gone, the street quiet, the neighborhood watching. For the first time in weeks, there was peace. Fragile, perhaps, but real. And yet, in the back of everyone's mind lingered the same thought. How far would he go next? The neighborhood felt different in the days after the towing. For weeks, the stolen parking spot had been the center of attention, the flashpoint of tension. Now, with the sedan gone, there was a rare stillness. The street looked normal again, orderly, predictable, the way it was always meant to be. Neighbors who had grown accustomed to watching the nightly drama unfold now lingered on porches, remarking quietly about how much calmer the block felt. But beneath that calm, everyone knew the story wasn't finished. The neighbor was furious. Even without his car parked there, his anger radiated across the street. He slammed his doors harder, stomped up and down his porch steps, barked into his phone loud enough for half the block to hear. His pride had been wounded. His defiance shattered in front of an audience he could no longer control. The towing had humiliated him, and humiliation is a wound that lingers. At first, he tried to fight back. He argued with the HOA, claiming the space wasn't clearly marked, that the signs weren't official, that he hadn't known. But the evidence was stacked too high, the documentation too precise. Photos, videos, timestamps, neighbor testimonies. His excuses collapsed under the weight of proof. Every argument only made him look weaker, more desperate. When that failed, he tried intimidation. He lingered near the narrator's house, staring too long, pacing on the sidewalk as though his presence alone would unsettle him. But the narrator didn't flinch. The trap had already been sprung. The power already shifted. Every glance he gave was met with cold indifference, or, worse for him, quiet amusement. The neighborhood wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't a villain they whispered about in secret. He was a fool they openly mocked. And slowly, the energy drained from him. The fines piled up. The towing fees stung. His reputation crumbled. The same neighbors he once ignored now refused to acknowledge him at all. He was invisible, yet notorious, trapped in a community that had turned against him entirely. The narrator, meanwhile, reclaimed the rhythm of normal life. Every evening, the drive home ended the way it was supposed to, pulling into the assigned spot without worry. Grocery bags no longer had to be carried across long stretches of sidewalk. The irritation that had once clouded every night faded into a quiet satisfaction. But beyond convenience, there was something more. Outsmarting the neighbor hadn't just restored a parking spot. It had restored balance. It had proven that arrogance, no matter how loud, couldn't outlast persistence and strategy. The rules weren't meaningless. They just needed someone willing to enforce them in creative ways. The neighborhood, too, felt the change. The battle had unified them, turning whispers into solidarity, frustration into action. Where once they had rolled their eyes and kept to themselves, now they stood together. The parking drama had reminded them that community wasn't just about houses lined up in neat rows. It was about people standing up for one another when order was threatened. As for the neighbor, his defeat became permanent. His sedan returned eventually, but never again to the stolen spot. Guest spaces, distant and inconvenient, became his routine. He kept his head down, avoided eye contact, and moved with the quiet bitterness of someone who had been bested publicly. He had been outsmarted and he knew it. Weeks later, a moving truck appeared in front of his house. Boxes were loaded, furniture carried out, doors slammed one final time. The sedan followed behind the truck as it disappeared down the street, leaving the neighborhood in silence once again. There was no farewell, no wave, no acknowledgement, just absence. The block exhaled. Order was restored, not by the slow hand of the HOA alone, but by persistent strategy and the determination of one resident who refused to yield. The narrator parked in the assigned spot that evening with a quiet sense of victory. The painted numbers on the pavement weren't just markings anymore. They were a reminder of a battle fought and won. Not through shouting matches or reckless escalation, but through patience, clever planning, and support of a community that had finally found its voice. The spot was more than asphalt. It was a symbol. And every night, as the car slid neatly into place, the narrator remembered. Entitlement may try to take what isn't earned, but arrogance always leaves an opening. And when that opening appears, the smartest move isn't anger, it's strategy. Because in the end, the neighbor hadn't just been stopped. He had been outsmarted.